Don't ruin his evening, okay? Good evening. Welcome. Just like to begin with an announcement. Please put your phones on silent. Total, radical, complete silence. I don't want to offend you, but nobody wants to hear your cool ringtone in the middle of Brian Baruch's revelation, okay? So, even if it is Stairway to Heaven, okay? It is always a great honor, and it's always a great, you might say, blessing when someone in our community gets a PhD from Hebrew University. And not Bar Ilan. So we'd like to honor and congratulate Baruch, and it's a great thing you got out alive. I mean, and we'd like to hear something of what you learned, and we would like to hear something about the journey. I know it's a bit of a cliche, but it is indeed true that sometimes the journey can be as interesting as the destination. So, Baruch, we bless you. It's our prayer that your experience at the Hebrew University and the positive encounters that you had with your advisor, Professor Schwartz, and others will turn out to be a great blessing to many people all over the globe. So we thank the Lord for your persistence. And we, again, all jokes and kidding aside, we're very thankful for the Hebrew University and the role they play, not only in this country, but with many Christians around the world. So I turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, David, and thank you, everyone, for coming. It's a great joy and honor to be here today. I thought it would never come. My wife did too. But it did, and so I'm very, very thankful. I want to thank David Pileggi and Christchurch staff and volunteers for hosting this special event. This event is a testimony of God's grace and faithfulness in my life and the support and encouragement of the various communities represented here and online. Praise be to God. Tonight's talk will be in 3 parts, as David has said. The journey, a second smaller part, acknowledgements, and 3, some select key conclusions from my research. As mentioned, David asked me to share how I came to this, to the research that I did, because the journey is sometimes as interesting as the destination. That already is very apropos for my PhD thesis, which is entitled Walking with God, Hebraic Metaphor and Halakhah in Jewish Discourse in Greek during the Second Temple period. The journey is important. The manner and the walking, sometimes even more than the destination. How did I come to research this? There was a book title back in the 70s called How Then Should We Live? The book title, even more than the book, gripped me and has remained a key question in my life. It's returned to me over and over again. How then should we live? Some of you might know Francis Schaeffer back in the 70s. As a child, I really wanted to follow God. In a young age, about 16, I was just struck by a little short article in a book entitled The Last Word by Jamie Buckingham. Every chapter had a pencil-drawn picture at the top, and this picture of this chapter said it all. A bird laying an egg in a nest that had no bottom. The egg, of course, would have splatted, but the bird was as happy as a lark. This author said the church is like that. It loves to make converts, lay eggs, but doesn't disciple well at all. That image stuck with me until today. I wanted to be involved in practical discipleship, how one should live after they turn to God. I've always been interested, even fascinated, in how we should live, and thus when I came to Israel, 1994, I sorted out my partial Jewish identity over many years. I turned to New Testament texts related to how a believer should live. Naturally, anything related to ancient practical ethics, Torah, and Halakhah was interesting to me. I wrote my MA under Dr. Serge Ruzer, who is also a part of my PhD committee and here present. Thank you, Serge. On the New Testament narratives in the context of contemporary halakhic debates, Jewish law debates, the temple demonstration and the vineyard tenants and son. The latter portion was reworked with Dr. Randall Booth and published in a book called Jesus' Last Week. And so I continued. Many years later, after the MA, I sought to begin my PhD with Professor Daniel R. Schwartz. I had a grand vision of covering all the language of practice in ancient Greek related to Jews. And I called my first proposal the language of practice, Jewish nomistic terminology in the early Roman period. Or another option was mapping Halakhah in Greek, the phenomenon and function of Jewish law nomistic language in the early Roman period. I wanted to know all these different terms related to Torah and law in ancient Greek and how they mapped and interrelated and functioned. But this was a large project. With a dozen terms or so more, I failed in part due to burying myself in secondary literature. I just read all these different things. I had to have state of research, right? And so I read everything, and there were so many terms and so many people writing on Jewish law, I got buried. And I stopped. And I paused for about 7, 8 years, and I had to reapply. Whew. Thankfully, Professor Daniel R. Schwartz was ready and willing to take me on again. And we narrowed it down. Narrowed it down to a simple word, halach. Just one word in Hebrew in all those forms. And its variants in Greek, or its equivalents in Greek in the Septuagint. Perevomai, peripateo, going, walking. A simple exercise, I thought. But beware of a diachronic study, yes? Where you have to map and know how this word was used in all of its different forms over 1,000 years in Hebrew or 500 years in Greek. That was a challenge, but I'm thankful that I've finished by God's grace and am here to testify to that today. I would like to now turn to the second part. That was a bit of the journey, and I have many people to thank. I'll try to be brief, but the list is long. I'm very thankful for so many people who have helped me along my extended PhD journey. The Lord who has allowed me to finish, thanks be to God. Shoshi, my wife, and our 7 children. I love you so much. Robert, Zichrono Lebracho, my father, and Linda is present here. Mom, you never stopped praying. Thank you. The Jerusalem Seminary, especially Advocate Michael Riddle, and the anonymous gift by a faithful Christian businesswoman that set Jerusalem Seminary in motion. Thank you, Jerusalem Seminary and Michael Riddle. I thank Professor Daniel R. Schwartz. I wrote, and I believe it, a better PhD advisor is impossible to imagine. Yeah. I'm so thankful for Dr. Serge Ruzer, who is my wonderful MA advisor, a scholar, and a mensch. Thank you, Serge. I'm thankful for Professor Malka Rappaport-Hovav, who opened up for me the world of linguistics more deeply, and especially this idea of lexicalization patterns, where you encode the movement or manner in a verb. I want to thank Dr. Jason Driesbach, whose lengthy dialogue and partnership and editorial pen were crucial. Ethan Knapp, whose encouragement and ongoing discussion pulled me through. Dr. Malcolm Lowe, whose close reading of the Greek text of the appendices helped me enormously stop mistakes and improve readings. Malcolm is here. Thank you, Malcolm. Dr. Asha Morthy for valuable comments and encouragement towards the end. Houghton University for a splendid venue for a PhD writing sabbatical in the fall of 2023. Elisheva for her circumspect editing and resolute belief in this project. Dr. Randall Booth, friend, mentor, dialogue partner, lover of the Ecclesia. Warren Nash, Harold and Joyce Kilgo, passed away now, but were early believers in me, the PhD, and Jerusalem Seminary. Dr. Halvar Ronning for the years of mentorship and rough sledding together. Where's Halvar? I've learned so much from you, Halvar. Thank you. Bishopville and Arkport, New York communities in New York. Gary Alley and the Narkey Street congregation for providing a spiritual orientation here in Jerusalem, especially from 1995 to 2010 and beyond, and providing a safe place to ask questions within a loving, Jesus-centered community. Abraham Ben-Hod and the Ma'ale Adumim congregation for providing a vibrant, Hebrew-speaking spiritual environment for our children and family to grow. And Reverend David Pleggy in Christchurch, Jerusalem for providing a sustained vision of responsible Jewish roots, teaching coupled with a keen sense of orthodoxy. Thank you, David. Dr. Gerald McDermott, dialogue partner, mentor, and friend. Reverend Dr. Mark Graham, David Paxton, and the St. John Lutheran Community. Rabbi Dr. Mark Kinzer, an inspiration and true blessing. Pastor Butch Deere, Dr. Petra Helt, my first teacher in Israel, who transformed my understanding transformed my understanding of early church history, and whose strong encouragement has helped propel my studies. And to so many more that have encouraged me to come to Israel, that have given me that robust life early in my years to ask these questions of how then shall we live. Thanks be to God. Part 3. Summary and select key conclusions. There's 3 main chapters in this body of work, this is my dissertation. Chapter 2 shows the prevalence of the walking metaphor related to morality and conduct, the prevalence of the metaphor in Judaic Greek texts. Chapter 3 shows its absence from Hellenic Greek texts. Chapter 4 shows its prevalence in the Hebrew Bible and later Hebrew texts, especially the Dead Sea Scrolls. And chapter 5 points to the broader historical conclusions suggested in the dissertation's findings. So, point 1, we say that the walking metaphor, walking with the Lord, walking before, walking after, walking in the ways of the Lord, is prevalent in Judaic Greek texts. But it's, point 2, it's absent. This metaphor of walking is absent in Hellenic Greek texts. And the third point is to say, where is this coming from then, right? It's coming somewhat from the Hebrew Bible, not so much the Septuagint, but its Hebraic setting and the Halakhic turn or Halakhic revolution. Halakhah of Jewish law was very, very important, more important in the late Second Temple period, right, from the Maccabean period onward. Let's unpack this a little bit more. So the first point, the walking metaphor is, in Judaic Greek, is very common. It's often with the word parevomai, meaning to go, as we see in the Septuagint, the translation of the Hebrew Bible, and in Philo. Also sometimes in the New Testament and in the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, part of the pseudepigrapha. Peripateo, rather than going, walking here, peripateo was very common in Philo, the New Testament, and an example in the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs again. A few times in the Septuagint, and sometimes this peripateo, walking, would summarize the word for going. It was used going in Septuagint, but it was paraphrased with peripateo. But the walking metaphor does not occur in Josephus. Why? Genre. Josephus was writing mainly for a Roman audience and not a Jewish or God-fearing Gentiles who were part of the synagogue. Philo is incredibly fascinating in the sense that Philo examples, 51 examples, occur almost exclusively in the first part of his writings before he went to Rome. And so we see that first part of his life, he was using the metaphor profusely because he was writing to a Jewish centered audience. A lot of it was exegetical, related to the Bible and commentary, right? But then later on, when he wrote, he almost never used it because he was pleading, in a sense, on behalf of the Jewish population after he had been in Rome and had been exposed to what the Jewish population needed. He shifted gears and did not use the walking metaphor as much. And this fits very strikingly with Martin Niehoff's recent work on Philo, strikingly. The point there is that audience matters. And there's also a change we can see from the use of parevomai, go. That's a good translation in some ways of the Hebrew word halach. Later on, this change shifts in Greek from parevomai to peripateo, walking, which is much more concrete. It has a preposition included in that, right? And so it's not so much going somewhere, but walking around. And that walking around word captures the manner of one's life better than a verb of motion that's going in a certain direction or destination. So why is there a change from parevomai, for example, in the Septuagint, to peripateo in Philo, in Paul, and John? One, it's genre, we talked about. And two, there was a halakhic turn, or a halakhic revolution. It mattered how you lived for your Jewish identity, right? It wasn't just who your mom was, and it wasn't just where you were born in the land of Judea. It also mattered how you lived that out. Let's look at some examples from the Septuagint briefly to just show how common the walking metaphor was in Judaic Greek. In the Septuagint, I'm just going to pick a few choice examples. Leviticus 26:12. I will walk among you, and I will be your God, and you shall be my people. Sirach, or Ben Sirach 46:10, highlights the proximity with God. And it's also in Hebrew, it's interesting. In order that all the sons of Israel might see that it is good to walk behind the Lord. And I want to emphasize that because sometime I'm going to work also on the connections between following and going. And we see that language is interconnected in some ways, although some people have tried to drive a wedge between that because the synoptics don't use peripateo or walking imagery much, but do use following. We'll come to this later on again. Another example, so we have Septuagint, Ben Sira, and now Philo. Hold on for this long quote. You ready? Whew. This is a great one, but it is long. Philo, on Migration 127 through 131, provides a rich example of a narrative allegorization of Genesis 17:4. And in these few verses, parevomai, go, occurs 3 times, twice in its first sense, the allegorized sense, Another is metaphorical sense that helps clarify and provide a proof text for the allegory. Here we go. We are told, this is Philo now, we are told next that Abraham went, even as the Lord spoke to him, Genesis 17:4. This is the aim extolled by the best philosophers, to live agreeably to nature, and it is attained whenever the mind, having entered on virtue's path, walks in the track of right reason and follows God, mindful of his injunctions, and always and in all places recognizing them all as valid both in action and speech. For he journeyed, just as the Lord spoke to him, Abraham, right? The meaning of this is that as God speaks, and he speaks with consummate beauty and excellence, so the good man does everything, blamelessly doing straight the path of life, so that the actions of the wise man are nothing else than the words of God. So in another place, he says, Abraham did all my law. Genesis 26:5. Law being evidently nothing else than the divine word enjoining what we ought to do and forbidding what we should not do. I could go on and on. There's words of doing and walking further, but I think you've gotten a good example of how Philo uses this so deeply. The combination of the passage here of journeying, of going, employed 3 times, of busying after, epo, following, opiso, doing, praxis, and doing, poeo, and law, nomos, is remarkable. If we turn to the New Testament, most of us will be more familiar with that. Mark 7:5, we're reminded that it says, Then the Pharisees and scribes asked Jesus, Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders? Peripetusin. Acts 21:21. But they, the tens of thousands of Jews who were zealous for the Torah that believed in Jesus, they have all been informed about you, that you teach, Paul, all the Jews who are among you, among the Gentiles, to forsake Moses, so that they ought not circumcise their children, nor walk according to the customs. So it's there in Luke. It's in Romans. And it's it's in almost every book that Paul writes. We'll give a couple examples. Romans 6:4. 32 times in Paul, every time used metaphorically, except once and that is a contrast to show that it's a flesh verse metaphor. Romans 6:4. Therefore we were buried with him through baptism into death, that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. Romans 14:15. John 8:12, John 2:6, we could go on and on. I'm going to give one last example here in John 2:4 that shows how halakhic, commandment-oriented this can be used. 2 John 4, I rejoice greatly that I have found some of your children walking in truth, as we received the commandment from the Father. But now, dear lady, I ask you, not as though I were writing you a new commandment, but one we have had from the beginning. Let us love one another. This is love, that we walk according to his commandments. This is the commandment that you have heard from the beginning. You should walk in it. Is the walking metaphor related to moral conduct common in Judaic Greek? And the answer is yes. It's ubiquitous. Almost. It's all over the place. Second point. The walking metaphor is absent from Hellenic Greek. By Hellenic Greek, I mean non-Jewish Greek. So that's a term I came up with to try to capture that. I evaluated close to 400 occurrences of peripateo from the 5th century BC to the 1st century AD. Those 5th century ones were helped by Malcolm's studies. Sometimes the chorus and 5th, 4th century Greek is very, very different. Right, and the words mean different things almost. So I evaluated almost close to 400 occurrences of peripateo, these over 6 centuries, and none of the Hellenic Greek texts use the walking metaphor morally for conduct. That's conclusive. That's important to show that it's not coming from a Greek text, at least peripateo. Now, parevomai is a more difficult and challenging word. Why? Because can you imagine analyzing the word go in the English language for 6 centuries or something? It'd never end, right? That's why I said diachronic studies are dangerous, right? These long studies over words. So I was able, with the help of the TLG, this fancy database, a Greek database, that has given different text genres. So I looked at the most likely genres of philosophy, theology, and rhetoric, right? Where you most likely find this walking metaphor, and it wasn't to be found in the 1st century AD. That's all I could cover. 1st century AD, as well as a few other texts and all the lexica that say that it occurs in the 3rd or 2nd or 1st century. This one inscription from Gadra, which is amazingly fragmentary, and he gives it as an example of how it's a basis for the walking metaphor, which it isn't, because it doesn't even really make sense. It's so fragmentary. So, if Greeks want to speak about morality and moral metaphors, what do they use? Things like medicine, images related. Have you ever heard of the physician of the soul? Right? We see that in 1 Timothy as well. Or traveling by boat. We do have odos, so the way is used metaphorically, but not walking. Right? So it's not like the Greeks don't use metaphors for moral conduct. They do, but they use different moral metaphors. Now, there was a couple close calls, especially with this word peripatetic. You've heard of the peripatetic philosophers? From the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century on, we have people that claim that they're walking and talking about moral and ethics. But they're really just conflating these words, because these philosophers were named for where they were to be found, not what they were doing. So the peripatetics are named peripatetics because they were at the peripatos, right, which is the walking colonnade, right? The Stoics were named Stoics because they were found in the Stoa, right? This, I think, for classical studies, this is a nice little significant point that isn't central to my thesis, but it is important, because as soon as a scholar thinks of, well, peripateo is of course used morally because of the peripatetics, but no, it's not. If you look closely, all those sources are 2nd or 4th or 5th century later, AD, CE. Another little small result of my research, but one of my examiners caught the footnote and liked it enough to mention it in their results, is that this walking imagery is also relates to Paul, not because he uses peripateo. By the way, peripateo is never used for his journey in the book of Acts. So some people have also speculated that. Paul uses this metaphor because he walks so much, and we see that in the book of Acts. Nope, doesn't use. So, but Paul's name in Hebrew that is then used in Greek sounds like a walking word. So Saul comes into a Greek form, Saulus, and that is not a pleasant type or a beautiful type of walk. So this undermines the idea that Paul changed his name, or Saul changed his name. It's not true. I think this is clear evidence. What I'm going to share now is that he was a wise man who had a name that sounded bad in another language and chose a different name. So he had 2 names, one name in Hebrew and one name in Greek. In the beginning of Acts, he's talking, the context is more Jewish, and the second part of Acts 1, Acts 2, second part is more Gentile, and he's Paul. What does Saulus mean in Greek? It means a loose or effeminate gait of prostitutes or homosexuals. So if Paul's going around saying, I'm Saulus, that's odd when we compare it to what he states in his epistles. And so naturally, Saul would want to be known as Paulus, right? So he has 2 names. He didn't change his name. So we established that One, the walking metaphor in Judaic Greek is very common. Two, that the walking metaphor doesn't exist, at least in peripateo, and not in prevomai in the first century from the most likely sources. Where is it coming from? From Hebrew, in a way. It's very prevalent in the Hebrew Bible. Almost 400 times of the 1,550 occurrences of Halakhah are used metaphorically for the moral metaphor. 381, if I'm not mistaken. A huge number of hitalech and halach and hilech and piel are used in a metaphorical sense. So this is one likely source. And yet, these Judaic texts are written in Greek. And the Septuagint doesn't use peripateo, but uses perevomai. It uses go. The Septuagint uses go, and later texts use peripateo. So, where is it coming from? Well, we do have a few texts, not many, one or two, in the Septuagint that do use peripateo or peripateo. But there's another context, and that is, and that is the Hebraic Revolution, the Hebraic turn. The Dead Sea Scrolls witness to this with this incredible rise of hitalech, as in walking, as in metaphorical usage, and we'll come to that in just a sec. First, I'm going to give a few examples in Hebrew as we wrap up very soon. Where does this occur? This Hebrew walking metaphor, where does it occur in the Bible? It's common, right? 381 times. Well, Genesis 5:22. Enoch was well-pleasing. He walked with God, right? Leviticus, Genesis 5:22, and all of the Genesis passages are not translated as walk, but well-pleasing. So it can't be a source for Paul or John's or Philo's occurrences, right? But it is in Hebrew, v'hitalech hanoch, right? He walked. And it's not talking about so much going somewhere. It's about how one lives. Leviticus 26:12 is a good example of peripateo being used in the Septuagint and hitalech in the Hebrew. I will walk among you and will be your God, and you shall be for me my people. Hitalachti betochachem. Right? 2 Kings 23. 2 Kings 23 says, Lord, remember, I implore you how I have walked before you in faithfulness. Hitalachti lefanecha be'emet. Right, so walking before God shows proximity and in truth or faithfulness of the whole heart. 2 Kings 23, good example. And in Deuteronomy, it's common, right, where you have this halach metaphor, and this is a covenantal framework. So Deuteronomy uses it often in relation to the covenant, and this I have to argue even further in the published version for one examiner at least. It's not only just from these narratives, though, or of Enoch or 2 Kings and Deuteronomy. It's a lot born out of the shepherding imagery of the embodied metaphor. So this metaphor of walking doesn't come out of a vacuum. It comes out of a lived state. People were wandering around and people were being shepherded, and we see this beautifully in Genesis 48:15. He blessed Joseph and said, the God before whom my ancestors Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day. This combines the image of both walking, metaphorically, for conduct, and also being shepherded by God. And I think this is part of that embodied conceptual metaphor, it's called. It's not only this shepherding, it's also the wanderings. We see that with the many different prepositions, multiple prepositions that are used. Lifnei, walking before God, walking behind God, and God walking in the midst of his people. So God is depicted as walking behind Abraham and Isaac as a shepherd, a position that is sometimes required to be a good shepherd. You know, a good shepherd is sometimes a person who is behind the sheep, pushing them forward. Sometimes he has to lead, and sometimes he has to push from behind. He's leading from behind. Other examples of God walking behind can be seen in Genesis 17:1. Abraham walked before God. Later biblical writers use this phrase, walking before God, in parallel with walking in God's ways. Conclusions. I've already given some, but this work has demonstrated the walking metaphor in Judaic Greek through the use of peripatein, uniquely conveyed conduct, since walking, peripatein, was never used in ancient Greek for this purpose. Its usage was not derived so much from the Hebraic usage found in the Bible, since prevomai, or go, was the expected word form, as from the embodied nature of late Second Temple Judaism, a lived tradition that expressed itself in Hebrew and Greek rather than merely a translated text such as the Septuagint. This is to emphasize praxis and was a nascent Halakhah for Jewish identity. The ongoing nature of Hebrew, both in written and likely spoken registers, right? Hebrew was still spoken in the first century, both BCE and CE, with elements of diaglossia, 2 levels, may have further contributed to the cultural linguistic context. The Jewish use of peripatein to convey morality and paranesis was a borrowed Hebraic metaphor. There's so many exciting details that I want to share, but I think this is supposed to be 15 minutes, and so I better cut to the very end. By God's grace, this dissertation will be published in the near future, in a few months or a year. Amen. The Judaic Greek metaphor of walking is a borrowed metaphor taken from a living Hebrew-speaking culture and part and parcel of the Halakhic revolution. It's not just your lineage and your location, but your practice that helped determine Jewish identity. Philo, Paul, John, the Testament of 12 patriarchs are witnesses to this Judaic Greek walking metaphor. I believe that the walking metaphor is the most common image for the spiritual life in the Bible. It relates to the walking and way metaphors, which are rooted in the shepherding and wandering narratives of the Hebrew Bible, which in turn impact the entirety of Scripture. Walking in the ways of God is active. It's not static. It's dynamic. You're always in relation to either God or God's commands or his way, which is an extension of God, his commands, right? So it's active, it's practical, it's a done deed, and it's relational, as I've just explained. It is a key component of a biblically based spiritual life. Going beyond the PhD, I hope and pray that this study will spur us on not just to study the ways of the Lord, but to walk them out, knowing that one of the key aspects of the walking metaphor is the nearness, the presence, and the proximity of the Almighty. Amen. This is in honor of my Uncle Larry. My Uncle Larry passed away in July, and he was a dear friend, and his wife, my aunt, asked me to bring and wear it here in Jerusalem. And in his honor, he wrote one Doctor of Ministry thesis and one PhD. One is how to be a president of a seminary. And so I'm reading that. That was for the Doctor of the Ministry. So thanks be to God. Thank you, Larry, for passing on all your leadership books. And thank you all for coming. Thanks be to God. Thank you, David. Thank you.